Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Fantastic. Thank you for coming out this evening to what I hope is going to be an interesting and informative event. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Nick Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Rowntree Society. The Rowntree Society is grateful to receive our current core funding from the three Rowntree Trusts: the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and the JRSST Charitable Trust, which is managed by the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. This year we've been marking 100 years since Joseph Rowntree's death with the Joseph Rowntree Centenary. And tonight's event forms part of the centenary, and I'm delighted we've been able to hold it here at Bootham School, where Joseph was both educated and also provided support. He and other members of his family were also involved, whether they were educated here or involved in the governance and funding of the school. The Rowntree Society's purpose is to build and share knowledge about the histories of the Rowntree family, the company and the trusts, and the continuing relevance of those histories to the challenges facing us today. And my hope is that that's what we're going to be able to do this evening through exploring the Rowntree's newspaper ownership in the early 20th century. We'll be hearing from three speakers, two historians in Charlotte Vallis and Dr. David Vessey, and a journalist and editor in Jim Waterson. And following their talks, we're going to have some panel discussion. And if you are watching this on YouTube, thank you, and it would be great if you could like, share and subscribe. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Charlotte Vallis is a part-time PhD student at the University of York. Her own research focuses on Russia in the 18th century, particularly considering the confluence of gender and power. However, during the summer, she completed an Institute of Public Understanding of the Past funded internship with the Rowntree Society, exploring the Rowntree family's newspaper ownership. And it's this research which she's going to be presenting this evening.
So, thank you very much for coming and listening tonight. My name's Charlotte. As Nick said, I'm a part-time PhD student at the History Department at York, looking at 18th century Russia, so only natural that I would choose to do an internship looking at 20th century newspaper ownership. So my project focused predominantly on the sort of first half of the Rowntree's ownership of newspapers, starting in 1903 and looking roughly up until 1923. And I looked particularly at the reasons why the Rowntrees chose to purchase newspapers, and then the problems that they faced in the first 2 decades of that journey. So my talk focuses on how newspapers were used as a political tool and the problems that they thus encountered in doing so. So I take you back now to 1903. Charles Starmer, I was so worried I was going to say Keir. Charles Starmer was a supporter of the Liberal political party, just like the Rowntrees, and he worked with Liberal press in Doncaster, particularly its flagship newspaper, the Northern Echo. And in 1903, he approached Joseph Rowntree, really very worried, because the Northern Echo's daily circulation was significantly declining. Simultaneously, Starmer pointed out to Rowntree, the conservative gutter press was on the rise. And his concern was that if somebody didn't step in to support the local press, then the Liberal Party would lose its opportunity to speak directly to the people. Rowntree agreed with Starmer that newspapers were an important tool for putting forward Liberal Party ideas, and he chose to invest in the Northern Echo and its sister papers, the Auckland Chronicle and the South Durham and Cleveland Mercury, which I hope I've got right. This is just the very start of Rowntree's ownership of newspapers, and very quickly he starts buying provincial presses around the country. In 1904, Rowntree establishes the North of England Newspaper Company. This is kind of a big overarching heading for the organisation of all of his different newspaper interests. In the same year, Joseph Rowntree established the Joseph Rowntree Social Services Trust, now known as the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. And this was intended to look after the Rowntree's political interests, so particularly be the body that directed their newspapers. When Rowntree established the JRSST, he put forward a memo stating exactly what he wanted the trust to do. And it's from this memo that I got the quotation at the first part of my talk's title. So this tells us an awful lot about what Joseph Rowntree hoped for from the newspapers. He says what he's really concerned about is the power of selfish and unscrupulous wealth, which influences public opinion largely through the press. And he goes on to say his intent for the Joseph Rowntree Social Services Trust is that it would be quite in accordance with my wish that they should control, by purchase or otherwise, a newspaper or newspapers, conducting these not with a primary view to profit, but with the object of influencing public thought in right channels. So he very clearly says this is not about making money, which is really lucky because they very rarely did. He's very clear that this is about supporting people in accessing political information, what he views to be the right channels. And there's that kind of interesting contrast. He says he's worried about people influencing a public opinion in the wrong way, but he wants to do it in the right way. So there is definitely that underpinning of political bias running the whole way through. Obviously had the right intentions, but possibly not acknowledging what's going on there. Once the papers took off and became an important interest, Joseph Rowntree was not involved in the day-to-day running of that. Appointed to be directors of the Joseph Rowntree Social Services Trust were people such as Charles Starmer, J.B. Morrell, and then the Rowntree at the helm of it all was Arnold Rowntree. He was a Scarborough Rowntree, and he seems to have been a genuinely very likeable, affable man. So he had a nickname that was given to him by the children of Bootham School and the Mount School. He was known as Chocolate Jumbo. And I wanted to get that in because I was only able to prove that that was true with the help of Bootham School magazine, so I just wanted to say thanks. Why put him in charge of newspapers if he's not cutthroat? His work for the family business previously had been in marketing and advertising. So I think possibly it was thought that he had the most direct link, direct experience, relevant experience to running of newspapers. He also personally himself would later go on to become Liberal MP for York. So I think there was that kind of personal political link that using experience on newspapers would have helped to develop for him. And then finally, I think that Arnold very carefully and clearly followed what his uncle wanted for the newspapers, and I think he was a good mouthpiece for Joseph Rowntree's wishes. So this quotation comes from a celebration for the Northern Echo that Rowntree spoke at in 1917. And I actually found this in one of 2 scrapbooks that Arnold Rowntree kept of important newspaper and political moments, which I thought was quite sweet. So he talks about a good newspaper expresses the thoughts, wishes, troubles, aspirations, and just complaints of the public. Nothing should be done to endanger the freedom of the press. In tone and motif, it's very similar to the memorandum that Joseph Rowntree put out in 1904. So 13 years later, Arnold is still following the desires of his uncle in the way that he conducted the newspaper business. So a little bit more about which newspapers they owned. To put it shortly, it's not very clear. So this is J.B. Morrell, and I felt like he deserved a picture. This is a report that he wrote on the history of the newspaper ownership towards the end of the 1930s. Bluntly, one of the questions that I was trying to answer in the internship is who did buy the newspapers? Where exactly did the money come from at any given time? And the answer is I'm not really sure. When you look through the meeting minutes for the Joseph Rowntree Social Services Trust, sometimes the trust buys the papers outright. Sometimes the Starmer Group buys the papers, and that's Charles Starmer, J.B. Morrell, and Arnold. Sometimes individuals buy them themselves, and there's notes saying, effectively, sorry, Arnold, we'll pay you back in some different minutes. So it's not really very clear. What we do know is that their interest in the provincial press grew absolutely huge and very, very rapidly. They had newspapers across in Manchester, they had the Sheffield Independent, that you'll hear more about later, down to Birmingham, all across the north and getting further south. I think they stretched the definition of what the north is quite far. It did remain the provincial press until 1907, when they bought the Nation newspaper, more of a national paper, and I'll talk more about that later on. But in short, it was big, it was complicated, and not entirely financially clear. And on that, in terms of the problems that they faced in owning newspapers, money was a key one right from the start. Obviously, all of the provincial papers that they bought because they were struggling to fund themselves. And even though they did generally manage to improve circulation of newspapers, very, very few of the newspapers that they bought ever actually managed to make a profit. The Sheffield Independent, which was one of the few consistently profit-making papers after a time, the profits from that were used to offset losses from other newspapers. And between 1903, the start of their ownership of newspapers, and 1914, the Trust lost £60,100, which in a light bulb moment on the way here I decided to Google, and it works out about £8.8 million today. You constantly see in the minutes of the meetings concerns about money in some way or another. So this one is from 1904, and I picked ones all the way through towards the end of World War I, but I could have filled that page. There are talks about how much each different paper is losing. There are constantly loans being given out, up to kind of £5,000 a time. And then the following year, when the loan should have been repaid, there's a note going, yeah, we've written that off. The money never comes back into the trust. So it was a constant money pit the Rowntrees were trying to manage. That only got worse with the onset of World War I in 1914. As paper began to be used for more important things, became more scarce, became more expensive. So the Rowntrees simultaneously had to think about reducing the amount of paper literally used in their newspapers, whilst also increasing the cost of the newspapers, something that they were then concerned would put the papers out of the price range of the very people that they were hoping to reach. So the problem just kept getting worse and worse over time. And by the end of World War I, there was a real sense of tiredness. So at a meeting in June of 1919, Sebom Rowntree, who was not directly involved in the newspapers, but was a director for the Social Services Trust, at a meeting, he says that he's really concerned about the weight, the financial and the mental weight that the provincial press is placing on the people who are in charge of running it. And he says, in relation to the available time and the health of the 3 or 4 men bearing the main burden of the work, he thinks the press should be sold. Now, Arnold and JB Morrell respond, and at this particular time, they say no. They say, we're the guys that are doing it. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it's time consuming. Yes, it's very expensive, but it's important, and we want to keep the press. And Joseph Rowntree backs them. That's not the case for very long, though, as in a follow-up meeting in February of 1921, so less than 2 years later, it's actually Morrell and Arnold that come forward, cite the heavy burden that they have been placed under by newspaper ownership, and the decision is taken to sell the provincial press. And effectively what happens is the North of England Newspaper Company, so the big consolidated newspaper interests, are sold to a new newspaper conglomerate, the Westminster Press Provincial. That's run by a fellow Liberal supporter, Lord Cowdrey, and the key difference is that Cowdrey has incredibly deep pockets. So they pass the interest over. That's not to say that the Rowntrees then aren't involved in newspapers at all, because actually Arnold, for example, remained a director on the board of the Westminster Press Provincial until 1951. Give it 3 years. And I kind of think of it as if they were the captains of the ship before they become the deputies after the Westminster Press Provincial. It just means that the financial burden isn't solely on their shoulders anymore. So, money being the most consistent problem, there were some moral scandals that took place as well. We like a bit of gossip. So, one of the key things that had helped with the circulation of newspapers was things like betting information. So originally, much of this provincial press made its money or got people to buy the newspapers because they included information about where to bet, when to bet, and who to bet on. And when the Rowntrees and other Quaker families such as the Cadburys took over newspapers, there was a consideration and a deep discussion about could this be married to their religious beliefs. And in 1906, 1907, the decision was taken to stop putting betting information in papers. Using the Northern Echo as a case study, you can see the impact that had on their numbers. So when they first bought the newspaper, the daily circulation, sorry, I'm in your way, was 3,000. They had improved that to 30,000 by 1906, looking good, but still not making money at that point. And then by 1909, it had dropped by 5,000 daily. And what they particularly noticed was that during peak times for races, the numbers dropped even more because the betting information wasn't in there. This was having such a negative impact that in 1910, they took the decision to reinstate some of the betting information. They reached a compromise. They put in information about where the races were being held, but didn't tell you who to bet on, which they had to become comfortable with. This was not good enough for a lot of people, and fellow Quaker and chocolatier Edward Fry actually released a public pamphlet criticising the Rowntrees and the Cadburys for doing this. He saw it as a money grab, effectively, and was very, very angry about the moral and religious compromise that had been made in order to make money from his point of view. The Cadburys and the Rowntrees worked together on a reply to this, and they stated that it wasn't about making money, because they weren't, but that actually it was about trying to make sure that people got the political message that they needed to hear, no matter what, the means kind of justifying the ends, or the other way around. They also played on the Quaker belief that you shouldn't censor information, and they said, therefore, we're not censoring people, we're trusting people to know what to do with this information for their own good. But it was a very, very big scandal at the time. Now, the final part of my talk leads us on to another consistently scandalous man. So I mentioned that in 1907, the Rowntrees bought the Nation newspaper, their national newspaper. And this was led under the editorship of H.W. Massingham. He was a Liberal supporter at the time, and he was given almost complete freedom of editorial freedom to run the newspaper as he wished. And it was really successful in lots of ways. It became considered a kind of intellectual hub for the Liberal Party, and it attracted all sorts of exciting people to write for it, from Winston Churchill to A.A. Milne, which I thought was really cool. Massingham held weekly Nation lunches where discussions were had about what should be in the next issue. It was noted, however, that ultimately this was Massingham's paper. He would have the discussion, but the mood and the tenor would be what he wanted it to be. Massingham was never ever afraid to confront an issue head on, however, and this led to a lot of issues for the Rowntrees at times. So one slightly awkward thing is that Massingham hired consistently to write for the paper H.W. Nevinson, which is a name you might remember because he was the man that brought to light the Rowntrees' link to slavery through their ownership of plantations. So somewhat awkward that he was writing for one of their key newspapers. Massingham was also absolutely dreadful with numbers. In spite of the prestige attached to the Nation, it didn't come close to making money, and he ran it into the ground financially without taking any responsibility for this. Things came to a head, however, once David Lloyd George became Prime Minister in 1916. Massingham was still just about a Liberal at this point, but he was definitely not a Lloyd George supporter. And under him, the Nation started publishing not just attacks on Lloyd George's policy, but actually personal attacks on Lloyd George himself. There are some quite nasty things that he wrote. And in 1916, Seaborn Rowntree, at a meeting of the Joseph Rowntree Social Services Trust, brought up the issue and was really quite frustrated by it. He said that he'd been speaking to Lloyd George and that Lloyd George had expressed his frustration that a newspaper owned by those friendly to him were being so personal in their attacks. Seebohm viewed Lloyd George as a personal friend. He stated that what Massingham was writing was not only inappropriate but also libelous and put him, Seebohm, in a false position, and that he could not have it anymore. He wanted a motion passed that the Nation and other newspapers would no longer include personal attacks. Policy was fine, but personal attacks absolutely not. The motion is passed, and Arnold Rowntree, agreeing completely with Seebohm, says, right, I'll go and I'll sort it. He did not. He goes to speak to Massingham about it, and Massingham will not accept that he needs to change his tone. He's got editorial freedom, so why would he? And there's some quite heated discussions between the two. There's also a really fantastic letter of H.W. Massingham's that refers to Arnold as turnip-headed Arnold as a result of this falling out. But effectively, Massingham just keeps on doing what he wants to do. The money issue gets worse. It's the middle of World War I, and we already know that they'd chosen to start selling off the provincial press after the end of World War I. Eventually, the money situation and the fact that Massingham isn't listening to them, as well as his own personal issues with health, mean that the decision is taken to sell the Nation. Arnold approaches Massingham and tells him about it. Massingham is furious. He says the only reason the Nation has no money is because the Social Services Trust stopped funding it when he dared to disagree with Seebohm. So Massingham asks for time to raise money to buy the newspaper himself, and he is given that time. He doesn't come close. He doesn't raise half the amount of money that is required to buy the Nation. But he gets really frustrated with what he sees as his newspaper being sold out from underneath him. So he goes above Arnold and he writes directly to Joseph Rowntree. And he says in this letter, the only reason that the Nation has problems is because I dared to not do what Seebohm wanted me to. The money issues wouldn't be there if I hadn't done that. You need to sort this out. And I thought I'd include Rowntree's reply to Massingham, because I thought it was a really nice kind of look behind the curtain and a nice moment of seeing how Rowntree felt about his family. Because if you look at particularly the third paragraph, he says, "To myself, it has been a great disappointment that the Nation could not be continued on the old lines. You speak of Seebohm's strong objection to the policy of the paper in relation to Lloyd George, and of the resulting financial difficulties. But the financial difficulties are apart from this." Rowntree makes it clear he will not accept criticism of Seebohm. He is putting the responsibility for the paper's financial issues back on Massingham's shoulders. Ultimately, in 1923, the Nation is sold, and the story goes around that Massingham was not given a chance, that he was stabbed in the back by the Rowntrees. The first issue of the brand new Nation, without Massingham as editor, is an issue published in his honour. It is very anti-Rowntree, very pro-Massingham, and the story becomes that he was literally betrayed by the Rowntrees. And there are lots of public statements in his favour and against the Rowntrees. Arnold issues a reply to this, but it's not very successful. When Morell released his retrospective on newspaper ownership at the end of the 1930s, he still had to respond to these claims that they had chucked Massingham away without even thinking about it. So it remains a stain on their family name for quite some time afterwards. So lots of scandal for them. So thank you very much. I've lost all sense of time. But I hope you've enjoyed what has been just a small insight into the Rowntrees' political forays and their forays into newspaper ownership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So next up, we've got Dr. David Vessey, and he's worked at the University of Sheffield since 2006. His PhD was titled The Downfall of the Liberal Party and the Rise of Labour, Sheffield Politics 1903 to 1924, which contributed to the wider historical debate on both parties by demonstrating that Sheffield's experience validates interpretations of liberal decline that predate the First World War. Most of his research is positioned at the intersections between media and political engagement in modern Britain, and is currently investigating how the media and Britons themselves represented the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century. This evening he's come to talk to us about the Sheffield Independent, one of the newspapers, as Charlotte said, that the Rowntrees owned in the early 20th century.
Okay, thanks to Nick and Olivia for inviting me this evening. Bear with me if my voice fades out occasionally. It's the perils of a new brood of undergraduates every September, I'm afraid. So I'm really grateful to Charlotte actually for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in contextual terms that allow my specific case study of the Sheffield Independent to sort of exemplify many of the patterns and events that she talked about in her introductory session just now. What's fascinating about the Sheffield Independent, as I'll come on to, is how much it is a factional division that becomes transposed onto personality politics in Sheffield itself. There are questions about how unique this is in provincial newspapers, or indeed in national ones even today. But I just want to start by saying a few words about Sheffield, the Steel City, where the events that I'm going to talk about take place. The largest village in England, as it's still known even today. It's a city divided at the start of the 20th century on two primary bases. One is the ongoing Boer War in what becomes South Africa between 1899 and 1902. And the Liberal Party in Sheffield, as elsewhere, is divided between two different ideological mindsets on empire. One becomes caricatured as Little Englandism, the idea that Britain shouldn't be in the business, certainly of acquiring new colonies, let alone administering the ones it already has, versus more jingoistic liberal imperialism, the rallying cry that actually the British imperial project is a good thing and shouldn't be apologised for. The other basis is in economic terms, because very quickly, and certainly by the 1906 general election, the dominant political debate of the era is over the very unexotically named tariff reform, which is whether to place import duties on goods from around the world, protecting via imperial preference those from the British Empire. And this is where the personalities enter the fray. And the first of these is this rather dignified looking chap. I say dignified. I think it's a safe historical judgment to say he wasn't a very nice person. But this is Sir William Clegg, and he has a fairly typical kind of CV for many of the local luminaries that you see across Britain in this period. He dominates the local Liberal Party for the first 2 decades of the 20th century. These various sort of organisational bodies that are formed, the United Liberal Committee, the Liberal Federation, the Liberal League. He leads the party on the City Council, which periodically changes hands between the Liberals and the Conservatives before the First World War. He's a gifted sportsman. He's capped for England. In fact, he's the 17th international, according to the FA's website, capped international for England. And more importantly, for Sheffield Wednesday, which for my sins is where my allegiance lies. He's a successful local solicitor, and his imprint and connection with the Sheffield Independent existed in the form of his partnership with John Derry, who edited the paper until 1908. John Derry is again one of these figures. He's a local councillor. He's a failed parliamentary candidate. Again, they follow a quite similar blueprint. Now, the other half of this divide is this chap who is caricatured here, fascinatingly, in an Independent cartoon from October 1899 with the magnificent sideburns. This is Henry Joseph Wilson, and he is the antithesis of Clegg. They are polar opposites. He is an MP for the neighbouring mining district of Holmfirth. He's a vocal opponent of the Boer War. He wheels a cart around different parts of Sheffield and clambers on it and starts lecturing to the local populace about the evils of the Boer War. You can imagine how this goes down when people are just trying to get in their local pub for a pint in the evening. He's a nonconformist, and he's a supporter of progressive causes. He's very mindful of encouraging the nascent Labour movement, trying to keep it within the parameters of the Liberal Party rather than forcing them towards independence, as inevitably actually happens. And this divide becomes centred on the Sheffield Liberal Federation, which is on the Sheffield Liberal League, which is the body that is formed to pursue Lord Rosebery's brand of liberal imperialism. And this is Clegg winning at this point in time. He's vanquished Wilson in these sort of internecine squabbles over the policy and ideology of the local Liberal Party. And indeed, it's quite fascinating that how much the Independent comes to be a focal point in this squabble. Interestingly, this cartoon from 1899, he's being lampooned here because he'd given a meeting and he decided that if the local press, like the Independent, wanted to report the findings of the meeting, he had to have final sign-off and censorship, in effect, on what is reported in the paper. So you can see them here caricaturing him. This is his son Oliver in the corner walking off with a copy as they're sort of mocking him for his views and his distrust of the Independent at this point in time. So what is the paper actually like at this point in time? Well, it struggles to a large degree. Charlotte set out some of the issues that many of what become the Rowntree papers have, and that they are saved predominantly from the financial difficulties that they are enduring. The local press landscape was dominated by the conservative Sheffield Daily Telegraph. That was published twice daily with morning and evening editions, whereas the Independent was only published in the morning. There are various plucky sort of left-wing Labour papers like the Sheffield Guardian that are around for a few years here and there that sort of complete the picture. So in August 1907, the Liberals sort of get ambitious about trying to bridge this gap. They want to overhaul the Independent and to introduce an evening edition in the first instance. And they calculate that around £10,000 needed to be raised to do this. We can never translate those values precisely into 2025's monetary worth, but that's about 1.5 million that they need to raise to fund this expansion to the Independent. And this shows us how much importance and how much financial heft they're prepared to shoulder to sustain the movement and the party via the local press. But actually, this prompts another round of internal feuding. H.J. Wilson, for example, he refuses to contribute to the funds at this point in time. His family made money in manufacturing, in steel and iron manufacturing, as is the way in Sheffield typically in this period. He refused. He said, I'm not going to do this while Clegg is the proposed chairman of the new venture. He wants no part of this. And he also objects ideologically, and this is where betting enters the equation in Sheffield Independent's case, as it had more widely. He wrote to Clegg at this point in time, and he said, there is a strong belief that no evening paper can exist without pandering to the betting man. For myself, I should not feel it right to seem to sanction the publication of such mischievous stuff. And this sounds slightly caricatured, but there is a sincerity here and a principled stand that he's making, and we'll come back to this in the context of the Rowntree Trust in a moment or two. But they nevertheless raised the money. And there is they launch an edition of the Independent that they rename the Sheffield Evening Mail in July 1908. And it kind of goes belly up quite quickly. By February 1909, the company is in financial difficulty, and they reckon that receivership was on the cards by April, so within a few months. And this is where Wilson spots his opportunity. Now, he already had a connection with the Joseph Rowntree Social Service Trust. He sought the counsel of Joseph Rowntree, for example, in 1895. That was a prior occasion when there was an attempt to invest and expand the Independent. He discussed the merits of putting money in at that point when he didn't have complete control over its affairs and operations. And this is where, in the Independent story, again, Charles Starmer, tellingly we've used the same picture. It shows you how little and infrequently he's photographed in this period, I suppose, who had began his career via the Northern Echo in Darlington in 1899. And he is given by Wilson the information on the the Sheffield Independent and including the accounts, and he's horrified by what he finds. Not the first time, as we've heard this evening, that someone connected with the JRSST becomes horrified at the financial state of these local newspapers. He writes that the books have not been kept in a very clear way, and it's not easy to grasp the present position or to ascertain what money has really been lost on the paper. The trading accounts are by no means clear, and the balance sheets give no information at all. Now, this is humorous, undoubtedly, but it shows us how the lines blurred with these local newspapers at the provincial press between them being newspapers and offering a service beyond politics to a local clientele and being political ventures. When they're ran as the latter, they're very hard to sustain financially. It does have to be said, however, in the defence of the people associated with the Independent, that the fortunes and the plight of it at this time are not isolated. So if we look at the period 1900 to 1914, when the First World War intervenes, provincial newspapers had declined from around 70 morning editions in 1900 to 42 by 1914. And this is partly a consequence of the accelerating reach of London's commercial press. Starmer even noted, in commenting on the position of the Sheffield Independent, that the Daily Mail sold more copies in Sheffield than the Independent and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph combined. And that creeping metropolitan press is not just unique in Sheffield's case. But Wilson's hope, as he puts it, is that at least one or more thoroughly capable and practical newspaper men who are also sound radical politicians can be found to look after it. And this is where, as Charlotte says, that statement of principle that underpinned the JRSST's attitude to newspaper ownership comes to the fore. This again seems like a really fertile potential acquisition for them to push lines that are sympathetic to liberal positions and to maintain the financial health of the paper. And so a new halfpenny paper is launched on the 4th of October 1909. The directors under Starmer's management are Arnold Rowntree and J.B. Morrell. And we also have Henry Wilson in the background as a further investor, although he's not involved in the day-to-day operations of the paper. And it has to be said that this works, that the paper is rejuvenated. Its circulation increases from a modest 7,000 to 30,000. Sheffield's population at this time is about 500,000, so its reach is not necessarily titanic, but it's reaching a significant chunk of the local population. And indeed, it rises to 40,000 by the end of 1910. They do this by making some compromises, however. They strike off the Sheffield Evening Mail. It just goes back to the Morning Independent. But there's a real optimism, interestingly, behind the operations of the paper. So Arnold Rowntree writes to his wife that by 1913 Sheffield will pay its way. And indeed he's right. By the end of 1913 they're making a modest profit of sort of £1,400 or so. And it's at this time that the Trust is acquiring other newspapers like the Birmingham Gazette, as well as the Independent and the Northern Echo. But this is where the issue of betting comes back into the story again. And there is this real tension that the Independent also goes through in the attitudes and the debates within the ownership group. At a meeting of directors in May 1914, Joseph Rowntree wrote that he expressed his great anxiety that some statement should appear in the papers whenever sporting predictions were published, making it quite clear that persons who followed these predictions would in the long run be likely to incur loss. But the fascinating thing is there is also a sort of intellectual tension here, because the Trust is spending also a lot of money on anti-gambling propaganda at the same time as it's presenting these betting tips in its local newspapers like the Independent. So for him, it sort of makes sense to sort of pick one side or the other. But tellingly, and this is where the divide between the politics of papers and their commercial imperatives rears its head again. Rowntree never overrules his directors and local managers on this issue. He recognises that newspaper men knew best. He's been discouraged to some degree by the Northern Echo's experience, as well as Charlotte outlined, where circulation plummets as they experimented with taking away these tips. But it's also notable in their defence that when other progressive papers are launched in this period, like the Daily Citizen, which was kind of sponsored by the Labour Party, it was seen as its attempt to counter the Conservative-dominated national press. But that paper, it does have a comprehensive betting service. And it's this sense that if you didn't have that, you will just not reach anyone. And therefore, whatever politics you're trying to sort of imbue your readership with, they will never have it if they don't pick up the paper in the first place. So it's the lesser of two evils in a way. Now, the First World War, as with so many provincial newspapers, is decisive in this period. Not initially in a discouraging sense, though. By 1960, the circulation had hit 70,000, and they were achieving a comfortable profit of nearly £5,000 each year. And this is a significant achievement in Sheffield's case. So for comparison purposes, the Manchester Guardian, which becomes the Guardian of today, its circulation is only around 40,000 at this time. So Sheffield is outstripping it quite significantly. These are 1910 figures for circulation, I should say, in the Manchester Guardian's case. And it's so successful that the shareholders are diverting the profits from the Independent into the now ailing Northern Echo, and they're expanding. This is where their ambitions get a bit far ahead of their actual circumstances. They secure new premises at the heart of Sheffield's business and retail centre on a site on Leopold Street. I think it's now nearby the Leopold Hotel, as far as I can ascertain anyway. But this requires a loan of up to £20,000, which is an immense sum for this period that they're taking on the liability for. But with the end of the war, interesting, it's not the war itself and the effect of things like the rationing of paper that's decisive, it's the aftermath of the war where this very quickly becomes an albatross around the necks of those involved. So Henry Joseph Wilson had died in 1914. They'd sold their original shareholding to the other directors. And by February 1922, the Trust was spelling it out like this. They said, soon after the armistice, newspaper conditions became very difficult, largely because of the exorbitant prices charged for paper. 1920 and 1921 have been disastrous years. Extensive unemployment has meant decreased sales and lower prices for newspapers, whilst bad trade has produced the worst year for advertising that has been known for a long time. The losses incurred by the different newspapers have been very heavy. In 1921 alone, in the beginning of 1921, not for the full calendar year, they lose £38,000 on the Independent. That's about 2.2 million or so in today's values. And this is when, as Charlotte said, the paper, along with the Trust's other assets, is merged into the Westminster Press Company under Lord Cowdray. So I just want to end by saying a few words about what kind of paper the Trust gets for their money. And as I've just mentioned, they're spending a lot of it on sustaining the paper. Well, under Wilson's control, Clegg's position is eschewed and he is pushed to the margins, at least in the operation of the Independents. Clegg, for example, is particularly vocal in his support for the national coalition with the Conservatives that happens in May 1915. This is still under Asquith's premiership. But the Independent is having no part of this. It doesn't want to countenance the idea that Asquith would be bringing Conservatives into his administration. And it's even more outspoken in December 1916 when Lloyd George rises to the premiership. He is nominally a Liberal Prime Minister, nominally at least. But the Liberal Independent will not have any part in many of the things that he does as part of his wartime premiership. And press censorship is instructive in this regard. When the Press Bureau is founded, the idea being it's a sort of clearinghouse for official war news and the national and local press, not censorship per se, but it is controlling the flow of information and the flow of news and what actually gets disseminated to the reading public. The Independent splashes this editorial where it says, under no pretense will we consent to wear the shackles that are being forged for us. Mr. Asquith is still the people's leader. This is the perception that Lloyd George has sort of took a dagger to the back and got rid of him. They say, we appeal to him to take action immediately. George, this is what they call him. It would have been a calculated slur to get rid of the Lloyd part of his name, that Welsh affectation that he'd taken on. George and those who are bolstering him up will tumble from their rubble pedestals before the British public will submit to be fed by an illiterate gang working under the label of the Press Bureau. And the paper is very proud, and had been even before the First World War, that it is taking positions against the seeming headlong rush towards conflict. In 1912, for example, they were proud that it had broken with the Liberal League and promoted opposition to war at a time when the Daily Mail and other national newspapers were printing lurid allegations of German belligerence. And the final act, I suppose, this is one of Wilson and the Independent triumphing from the grave over Clegg's continued authority. Clegg moves very clearly towards the right, even further than he had been in the early decades of the 20th century. Indeed, if we were to transpose him onto the modern-day Conservative Party, he wouldn't just be in it, he'd be quite rightwards within it. And he actually encourages people to vote Conservative in 1924, despite being a Liberal. So keen is he, and so concerned is he to keep Labour out as the city begins to cleave in left and rightwards directions. And so even earlier than that, in July 1920, the paper had written about Clegg's politics. We have come to the parting of the ways. It's time for liberalism to assert itself, even though it means the open disintegration of the party. And so its principles always come before the narrow calculations of party advantage. And that's the kind of paper that the Trust money is paying for. And I think there is a nobility of purpose here that the founder, Joseph Rowntree, would have admired, even if many elements of this story would have been discouraging. So what's the moral of this? Well, I was thinking on the train over here of two things in particular in reflecting on this story. One is that there is this tension between being commercially viable and politically influential. But those two things need not be in antagonism with each other, dependent on if the public is with you. So these causes, like liberalism, like the local party, like progressive politics, can still be pushed and commercial viability can still be maintained, but the alternative is also true. When the public falls out of favour with those things, the paper ceases to be viable in either political or commercial terms. And it is noticeable, secondly, in conclusion, that the fortunes of the Independent mirrored those of the local Liberal Party. Before the First World War, it had shared control of Sheffield City Council with the Conservatives, and indeed split the parliamentary constituencies before 1909. After the First World War, the Liberals are propped up by the artifice of Lloyd George's peacetime coalition. But by 1924, there are no Liberal MPs in Sheffield's case anymore, and the city is evenly divided between Labour and Conservative representatives. So it's a story that shows how the fusion between these papers and the local political representatives that champion them was so hand in hand and so synchronous in the first quarter of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm pleased that Jim Waterson has travelled up from London to speak this evening. He's a former media editor of The Guardian and founder of local news startup London Centric. His talk's going to cover who owns the media today and whether you can still influence the agenda by owning newspapers, and how the modern equivalent of the Rowntree family would be spending their money if they wanted to influence the news agenda now.
It's a short little brief set of topics there. So the most terrifying thing about giving this talk, apart from knowing that there'd be all of you here, was that I was required to submit the slides 7 days in advance, and I've never knowingly finished any bit of work more than about 30 seconds before it's gone live. So I put in far too much stuff, so please don't spend your time reading the screen. I'm going to try and tell you some stories instead. There's a bit too much in there and we'll rattle through it. But really quickly, I'm going to say slightly why after those two fascinating talks. I was giggling with delight internally for several reasons. One, I mean, you had a Liberal MP in Sheffield called Clegg going into bed with the Conservatives. You had the fact that anyone who's worked in a newsroom will recognise all of those tropes of everyone falling out with each other, the money going in places that no one can quite work out. Why is that person even still on the staff and how much are we paying them? It just is completely familiar. And also just the sums of monies and the sums of money involved in the way that owners speak about owning a paper. They all believe in the free press until one of their friends has a go at them over something that's in the paper, and then they immediately change their minds and do a different approach. So I'm going to really quickly explain, it sounds egotistical because you've come here to hear about the Rowntrees, but I'm going to explain why I've got something to say on this, because the three things that I've learned from being a working journalist, I don't have the in-depth knowledge on the Rowntrees that you've heard tonight. What I can do is give you a take on where I think the media is, where it's going, and as I said, rattle through to the idea of what the modern equivalent of the Rowntrees would be doing. And we'll get straight onto the questions because that's always going to be the most interesting thing. So think of me more as framing a bit of what you've just heard, but in the modern context. So just my background really quickly. I've worked at 3 outlets and one of them was a place called BuzzFeed, where we did viral content, and we were briefly all over the shop. We worked out how to go viral online. We invented all these tactics, and a guy called Steve Bannon took them all and used them to elect Donald Trump. The Guardian, I worked for 6 years as their media editor, which was mainly, dismissively, people at The Sun would say, well, you're the guy in charge of, you're the journalist who's employed to hate other journalists, and that kind of was the job. I'd sit in phone hacking trials, I'd sit behind Harry, I'd sit in, and basically would often be the only person there being rude about the other papers. That was what I did for 6 years for a living. And then what I've now done is I've quit to, partly after a chat with the guys who run York Mix, Chris, who's I had a lovely breakfast talking about local news, and there was a redundancy package on offer at The Guardian, and I quit to do that. So what I'm going to, and the reason I say this is because I think this is an interesting take on where the media is now, because it's led me to 3 quick conclusions. One, and this is great because it fits perfectly with what the historians came up with. There was no collusion beforehand. People say content is king. I honestly think distribution is king. You kept hearing that throughout this. We're buying a press. We're buying a physical printing press. We're buying the means of production, the means of reaching people. And that when we get rid of the betting odds, we lose our circulation, we lose our route to the public. Secondly, a very modern thing, which is what the modern equivalent of the Rowntrees be thinking a lot is how you capture the elite thought and whether that's separate from a mass communication model. That maybe you've got, it has always been the case to an extent, but what's perhaps odd now is that there's a real split between what mass communication is and what the elites are telling themselves. And because we don't have those newspaper circulations in the same way, people are losing their handle on what the public are really thinking. And then finally, which comes off the back of that, it's easy to scream at and shout at the things that you do recognise, because anything else is too terrifying to try and understand what people are actually consuming. The reality of the modern media diet is so chaotic. If you were running the Sheffield Independent in the 1910s, you were competing against the Nationals coming in and a couple of other outlets. You certainly didn't have radio, TV, and you certainly didn't have a random Facebook page that could, frankly, swamp all of what you were doing before you even knew that it was happening. So I'm just going to rattle through these and we'll get on to what the Rowntrees could do. But I want to talk about, and again, the best thing was that this was echoed, why do people own newspapers? So there's going to be slightly sort of pub quiz, how many can you recognise? But you've got Murdoch up there buying The Sun, which he just rebranded. Does anyone know the one in the top right? Thank you. The world's biggest YouTuber, making hundreds of millions a year, hundreds of millions of views with every single thing, far bigger than anyone on British television. Zuckerberg, who is Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Have a look afterwards, and you'll be enlivened. But I mean, he is bigger than anyone that's on British television by a factor of 100. And it says a lot that whereas in the past, you wouldn't have been able to reach that audience in the UK through anything other than linear broadcast TV. If you went out and asked anyone on Bootham under the age of 40, they'd all know who he was. So that's a sort of a real, you've got that real split. And this, I just like that picture, but this is what I grew up reading. You know, you'd still get the print paper and the York Press, and I think we've got some veterans of it here. It was an incredibly profitable paper, and it could set the agenda. So that's that version. But what this has led to now, because the old model of what were you buying when you bought the York Press from that guy waving it in front of Mansion House? You were buying actually a package. You were buying those betting tips. You were buying the things that the Rowntrees had been worrying out about a century ago. You were buying cinema listings, and you were also getting some news mixed into it. And you know, they could have been doing the proper news, but that wasn't what people were necessarily always buying it for. What's happened now is because that distribution has collapsed for print newspapers, because people can get the bits. If you want your betting tips, you search your betting tips. If you want the football fixtures, you search them on the BBC website. It's all disintegrated. That package of information that you bought because it was the only thing in your town or city that you could get, which then gave your liberal or conservative politician who owned it the ability to sneak a little bit of their personal views into the mix, that package has completely collapsed and disintegrated. So that means you're left with something resembling the Mail Online website, where you can't actually see the story because there's so many adverts, because they're trying to get pennies from every advert on there. Or you've got something like the FT, one of the best papers in the world, which will cost you £7 or £8 an edition and is only read by about 100,000 people, but it's quality. And that is the interesting thing that you've got, is that middle ground of the daily paper, which has some good stuff in it, has your package, it has this, it has that. That is what the Rowntrees we've been hearing about, that's where they were fishing, and that sort of mid-market has really collapsed. Then you've got the sort of people who are doing it for influence. And actually, I've got Murdoch on here twice because Murdoch sort of is a weird one. He quite likes profit, and the power that he goes for is normally power that benefits Rupert Murdoch. That comes with his personal conservative views, but it doesn't necessarily override them. Musk, he's bought Twitter. He spent 40 billion on it. Financially, complete basket case. In terms of influencing world politics, probably one of the most efficient injections of cash that has ever been made in history. He has spent 40 million on that. He has single-handedly helped tip the election in the States in favour of Trump. He briefly had himself appointed as head of a government department off the back of that. And in the UK, he has tipped the balance towards radicalising the mainstream of the Conservative Party to an incredible degree by changing the algorithm that underlies Twitter. An incredibly effective use of power. You've also got MBS of Saudi Arabia, who clearly sees that media and sport is the way to completely reframe a country that only 6 or 7 years ago was cutting up journalists with bone saws. And then you've got this gentleman here who, anyone recognise which country he's from? That's the owner of Man City and from Abu Dhabi, who also tried to buy the Telegraph, and then George Osborne messed up the details behind the scenes on that and told him it would be a really easy deal and there wouldn't be any issues, and instead there was the most almighty kerfuffle. But I think the most interesting and relevant man to, if we're talking about what the Rowntrees would be doing, is the one in the top right. Final pub quiz question. Anyone know that one? Yes, who's that? There you are. Well done. You win absolutely nothing, but there's that. Paul Marshall is a completely fascinating guy. He is a former Liberal. He was a close friend of a Clegg, this time Nick. He came up through the Liberal Democrats. He funded lots of Liberal causes for many years, and he is driven by a very, very strong personal faith. He is from the Alpha Course tradition of the Church of England. He views his job as spreading prosperity to raise people up, and he viewed that as being done through liberalism. He's founded a hedge fund, and he campaigned for the Lib Dems on the belief that he could do that. In about 2015, he did the most almighty pivot towards Brexit. He started funding very different causes. Within a few years, he was funding what would be called anti-woke media. He founded a site called Unheard. He then immediately started putting money into he founded helped found GB News and now effectively took it over from the founders and underwrites its losses for 30 million a year. And he then recently bought The Spectator for 100 million because he could. He is probably one of the most interesting and influential people in British politics and media today, and I think it's very telling that he's remained low enough profile that most people in this room wouldn't recognise him, whereas Murdoch's face would be recognisable. And he is the one I'm going to keep coming back to, because not only is he an ex-Liberal who came up through a similar tradition as the Rowntrees might have done, but he is one that has done the things most effectively in terms of influence in a way that maybe the Rowntrees would have wanted to have done. And so I'm just going to skip past this. This is a point I'll come back to about how you can capture an elite and move a policy in. A friend ran a campaign to ban the XL bully, and they had it done within 2 or 3 months just by dominating a very thin media space. And then obviously you've got the third category, which we'll just ignore tonight, which is that sort of public service philanthropy. I worked at The Guardian. These conversations that we heard earlier about anxiety over tensions and honestly, it just felt like sitting through one of the internal meetings that were debating things. So let's get on to whether, A, you can still influence people using newspapers. This is one of my favourite graphs, which ends in 2015. You don't need to be able to read the captions. You just need to see that those lines are going down. The big bright line at the top, the blue one, that's the Daily Mirror peaking at 5 million circulation in the 1960s. That red line going up that sort of bubbles along in the middle, that's the Sun under Murdoch. It goes from absolutely nothing to 4 million a day. I met the former managing editor of that period last week, and he cheerily told me that they hung a sign on the office wall saying, make it fast, make it funny, make it up. And that was their motto of that era. Now, you can just see that when the internet comes along, and remember that idea of the middle ground, the bundle, the information package that you were buying with the Sheffield Independent or whatever, that collapses. And that's what's happened here. Newspapers have just absolutely, as a print product, gone because you can get the information elsewhere. And the online eyeballs going on the web versions just haven't made up for it. So I'm just going to rattle through the next few ones because I want to get straight onto the Rowntree bit. This shows quite how big the change is. I think that's the Mr. Beast point we raised earlier. That big blue bar at the bottom, so these are age groups. The big blue bar there is how many people watch live traditional TV. And the pink bit in the middle is YouTube and TikTok. You can basically see that for youth audiences, live TV is dead. They just do not watch it. The average age of a BBC One viewer is their late 60s. Broadcast news is effectively not watched by working age people anymore. And so you've got this most incredible split in terms of how people consume the news on a generational divide, which is equivalent to some of the things that were being dealt with the explosion of the popular press in the early 20th century. And I'm just going to quickly get onto it. So the really big change, and this is what the Rowntrees would be doing if they're having a meeting and working it out, is that you used to follow and visit, let's say buy a newspaper, read a certain site, go to the homepage, and increasingly you're just scrolling through that Facebook feed. You don't know why things are coming to you. A computer is choosing the bits that come to you, and the bits that the service wants to send you are what will keep you occupied and on their platform. They don't really care whether it's made locally. They don't care whether it's true. They don't care whether it's AI. If you're TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or Meta, you just want to keep the eyeballs there. That is very hard, especially if you're doing anything remotely worthy. So this is, sorry, these I've got slightly fried. But what I guess one point I'd like you to take away is from this section is the idea that whether it's that graph of the newspapers going down or the TV audience shifting, the idea that the mainstream news is something edited by journalists and is not the aggregated, user-created social media content is a real challenge. Like, effectively, in terms of eyeballs, it's quite hard to decide sort of which one's actually leading the way. But if you put the money in at the top, you can still have an influence. So what would they do? That's Dale Vince on the left, who founded Ecotricity and is also very interested in media. And that's the most trusted man in Britain, Martin Lewis, who is money-saving expert. And I think somewhere between those two and Paul Marshall, the guy we talked about who owns GB News, you'd start to get your answer of what you would be doing. So first up, you've got the idea that print newspapers weirdly do still matter because enough politicians and people think that they matter, so they sort of matter as a result. So if you go on the BBC News website, you will find a paper review, and you will find the front page of the Express, which is selling about 100,000 copies a day on a good day. The Guardian's probably selling about 40, 50,000 copies a day. These are the figures equivalent to what we were hearing for the Sheffield Independent in the 1910s. And yet that front page is still there. It's still shown. It's still read out on Radio 4 in the morning. Almost it's a proxy. So there is a case for owning a newspaper because the BBC will repeat whatever you say in it, which is a very deranged and sort of odd situation to be in. Secondly, anyone with an iPhone, have a play on the way home or with an Android, whatever. There's only two really, so you're going to have one of them. Have a look at what the news app is feeding you, because a lot of distribution is now coming from the apps, and we keep coming back to that idea of distribution. If I was a Rowntree today, I'd be wanting to influence not necessarily the people creating the content, but the people distributing it. Google, Facebook, Apple News, they're the ones who are pushing it to millions of devices. They're the ones who have the equivalent of the printing press going straight to it. Words, very much over. No one's reading. Really, no one's reading. I mean, everyone I talk to in something resembling written media is saying in the last year or two there's been the most almighty collapse in reading words and shift to vertical video. You might recognize that in some of your own habits in terms of what you sit there watching. You might not even know why you're watching it. This was an experiment I did 5 years apart, in which we literally recorded people's phone screens. I went with The Guardian and we did it in 2019 during the election and 2024. And it was fascinating. 2019, people were still reading words. They might not be reading them in depth. They might just be looking at the headline. They might be skimming it. You could buy political influence by just being the Telegraph and pumping out a certain view, or maybe the Guardian pumping out a certain view. The change this time around was so much towards video that people were barely looking at anything in depth. And that was partly because, again, the distribution network had changed. Podcasts, they're basically becoming TV. Someone like Mateless would have been a shoo-in to be the BBC's election night broadcaster. She chose to go and do a podcast. In some cases, in some sense, she maybe has more influence than being a leading BBC presenter now. And of course, you know, again, the Paul Marshall idea that you could just do GB News. And interestingly, that was a disaster when it launched. I was at The Guardian, I was the media editor. I wrote all these gleeful stories about how they had failed, they were getting 0 viewers, and then they turned it into the most enormous success. Culturally, it's probably one of the most influential and important media stories of the last decade, and it absolutely sets the agenda in a large chunk of politics. And so they have absolutely shown their opponents how to do it. Whether or not you think that's helpful or not, or good for society, is a different matter. And then I think most importantly at all, influencer culture. And this is where it's all going to come to. My bet is that everything is going to end up more around individual voices than institutional. That the modern equivalent of the Rowntrees wouldn't be spending their money so much on newspapers, but on prominent locals who would deliver a certain message in a certain way. And that this frees you from some of the need to do journalistic traditions. It frees you from some of the need to do anything resembling objectivity. And it sort of leans towards a sort of a version of, in the same way that you would get your news from, or you would enjoy watching someone doing sports content, you might enjoy watching them doing news content. And opinion and reporting get very, very blurred in this way. And of course, local news. There is still a market for local news. That's the screen grab I took from York Mix the other day. People do want to do this, and local news, you could have a lot of influence very cheaply. I think I'm running a local news startup on a very tight budget, and have sort of managed to hire a few staff. You don't need that much money to start to have an influence on a local level, and that's very, very neglected. So look, I'm going to push straight on so we can get into the questions, but there's just a couple of more a couple more ideas I want to seed in you. So I hope I'm not overwhelming you too much, because I spend all day thinking about this, and you also want to sort of get back to the history element of it. So I appreciate I've taken it slightly off piste. Funding of think tanks is something that the Joseph Rowntree various trusts and societies have always sort of been part of and are doing that. That is a key media delivery mechanism. And forgive the swearing, but this is a technical term, shitposting as a theory of power, the idea of just swamping the zone with absolute dross. I texted a national newspaper editor to ask what I should be saying in this talk. How would you influence anything today? And their response was that starting to think you've just got to be announcing and doing mad shit 24/7 to keep the momentum up. The idea that there is no coherent single message that you can just do, that you've got the President of the United States putting out AI-generated videos of him as a king flying over his population, literally releasing effluent over them, and he just thinks that's a bit of fun. So that's what Donald Trump's been putting out in his socials in the last day, and that's the sort of world that we're living in, a sort of a world based around memes and deep irony and nothing resembling traditional media messaging. So, just going to really rattle through, and essentially everything is collapsing that the Rowntrees would have recognised. Again, more doom and gloom. So here we are. I mean, there's just, I could go on, but I prefer to get to the questions and hear your takes. The mass market is becoming harder and harder to reach. That idea of a sort of shared space, a shared community, experiencing the same programs at the same time, everyone on your street reading the same news. I was talking beforehand about how reading the York Press in the late 90s growing up here gave me a sort of idea of York as a city. The same for all the case studies we'd heard there. That is lost. You don't know what your neighbour is looking at. They might be down the weirdest internet rabbit hole. They might be looking at a particular influencer that matters enormously to them. The person down the pub who you used to roll your eyes at now feels vindicated because 50,000 people online are calling them a genius. That is the world we're living in terms of media consumption. People are switching off the news to an unbelievable amount. You can see this in all the market research. People are just sick of it. There's a reason that there's less hard news in your Facebook feed. It's because they've actively realized it puts people off and they don't want it doing it. How do you even get a hearing becomes more difficult. That's why you're going to see all politicians just going on podcasts. You'll find you'll be listening to that nice football or cooking podcast and suddenly you'll get the Prime Minister popping up and you're like, why are you here? Because it's the only way they can get to you. Because that 3-minute gap between the music on radio is where the news went. People are switching off and listening to their own thing instead. And so this is sort of where I've basically ended up, which is sort of screaming into the void. And as a practicing journalist, I have basically chucked everything up in the air. I've walked away from The Guardian and gone, what if I could do a standalone local news thing as an experiment? I'm running basically a media experiment on myself, and I guess hoping to have some of the thoughts and processes that I would be advising the Rowntrees to do myself if we were there. So thank you for listening to this slightly odd adjunct to the history of that, but I hope there were some things that will then get you straight back on to the historians and asking them questions and things that you want to be thinking about to throw what we've heard forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, you're all good. So we're going to have some questions. To get us going, I'm going to start. I've got a vague question for each of our panellists, but feel free to jump in if anyone else wants to contribute from the panel. So to start with, Charlotte, in recent years, the Rowntree histories that the Rowntree Society and others in York have been telling have tended to focus more on Joseph Rowntree and Seabohm Rowntree. And we've perhaps paid less attention to Arnold, Joseph's nephew. And I wondered what kind of impressions, I know you said some in your talk, but I was thinking about Arnold as a person and what kind of impression you had of him as a person, and particularly how he compared to how different he was to Seabohm Rowntree.
I think I kind of fell in love with Arnold a little bit. He seems to have genuinely been a really very caring and nice man. There's a book that's available of his letters that you cited to his wife, and there's more in the Borthwick archives. And that kind of consistent interest that he shows in his family, there's a period where he's constantly away in London and he's always writing back, asking for news on the family. He seems to have been genuinely interested and involved in every different part of his life. I wouldn't have called him turnip-headed. Comparing him to Sebom is really interesting because I think when they have been talked about together, the typical narrative is that they must have butted heads. They were such different personalities. There's no way they could have gotten on. And when I was looking into things, I found absolutely zero evidence of that whatsoever. They were at school at a similar sort of time. There's a biography of Arnold from the 1950s that talks about how they had very different interests. Arnold was a rugby player, Sebom much more kind of focused on the classroom, but actually how they shared similar friends, they weren't at odds with each other, they were just different. And I really enjoyed the meetings, I get that confused all the time, the minute meetings that I read where Sebom steps forward. He's not directly involved in the newspaper ownership, but it's obvious that he's really worried about the negative impact that it's having on the health of the people involved. And he's stepping forward to help his cousin and to advocate for him. I think often when he felt that Arnold couldn't. So yeah, the impression that I got was that they had a very positive relationship.
Great, thank you. David, as we've heard, most of the publications that the Rowntrees owned and invested in were local provincial newspapers. And I just wondered how important they would have been in the early 20th century for furthering the Rowntrees' political aims. Whether it was that was a good tool to use or whether it was opportunistic because they were the papers that they could own. And also how typical or unique the situation with the Sheffield Independent was in the challenges it posed to owning those local papers.
So I was thinking about this earlier, and one of the things that strikes me is even in this early period when, Jim said it earlier, this is not an age of radio or television or the internet. Soon it will give way to some degree to people's visiting cinemas and consuming newsreel sort of snippets of the day's events, even in the silent era. But there is this real gap between expectations and reality. The expectation is that the provincial press is important, but it's already starting to be threatened by syndication and the reach of the national dailies. It's astonishing to think, I mentioned there are more copies of the Daily Mail sold in Sheffield in 1908, which is when the Rowntrees are thinking of getting involved in the Independent. The Mail had only existed for 12 years at that point in time. It had not been around for a long time. It's founded in 1896, and then you have the Express in 1900 and the Daily Mirror in 1903, and they come to dwarf the operations and circulations of the provincial press. And I was thinking about this afternoon because I teach a course to my students on the 1926 general strike and just the reach of the national press and the techniques that they can use if we fast forward to the mid-1920s. At the time of the general strike, the Daily Mail is even printing editions in Paris and using aeroplanes to distribute them back into Britain and across the British Isles. That's the strength of financial resource, the strength of innovation that they're using. And the provincial press very quickly can't compete with that. And so both Charlotte and I talked about it, that they are able to do some quite impressive work about boosting circulations, but it's always a sense that this is a loss waiting to happen, and that there is an air of inevitability about the changes that are happening and the speed that are happening. Jim talked about some of that in the modern context, about how quickly the landscape changes. So in terms of the other question about the uniqueness, I'm always tempted to say that Sheffield is unique about everything. Less so these days. The joke about Sheffield at the beginning of the 20th century is that the only asset it had going for it was a first-rate service of trains to get away from it again. And my experience is that's not true anymore either. But they certainly think of themselves as quite unique. And the other factor that struck me thinking about the involvement in the Rowntrees is how difficult it is to navigate that civic pride and identity that people have, and that these local newspapers are at the heart of much of that endeavour. And they are inserting themselves into, as I sort of talked about, quite incendiary situations in many cases, where buying and indeed working on the paper are part and parcel of local political activity. And the lines become so blurred between those things, whether it's a Clegg or Wilson and so forth, that the Rowntrees have got this additional factor. Before they can revive a newspaper, before they can use it to spread the sort of practical political messages and causes that they're interested in, they have to deal with all this other stuff in an era when much of it, they would have been conscious, they were conscious about making savings, about using syndication and these services, and the tensions that creates in the local polity, where they're so proud of their difference and the distinctiveness.
Thank you. Jim.
God, did I do too much? I think I tried to do too much.
One of the things that I've been thinking about through your talk, but also just kind of thinking about the media landscape at the moment and how kind of fragmentary, changing, fast-paced it all is that role of journalists and also media owners, and whether those still exist in the way that we might think about them, not to want to do you out of a job completely, or whether there's a space in the future where maybe you don't need media ownership and journalists can do it themselves, or what's your thoughts?
So what I'm doing at the moment is a bit of an experiment in this. It's what if you try to sort of shrink a whole local newspaper into myself and one or two other people. So whereas if you're a Rowntree, you had to buy a press, you used to have to get someone to deliver the papers, you used to have to hire the reporters to do it. I'm publishing a twice weekly newsletter in London that I get people to pay for. I've got 4,000 people paying now. It's the biggest of its type in the UK after a year. And I do everything. I do the credit card. I was on the way up doing credit card billing refunds. I was doing the editing. I was doing the reporting. I've got one junior reporter working with me. It is crushing and overwhelming, but it is possible. And that is the really big difference to even a decade ago. It is just about possible if you've got a fair wind and run everything really hot and know a vague idea of what you're doing. You can have influence. This weekend, the Mail ripped off and ran across 2 pages a story that I'd done for my tiny little startup outlet, obviously without credit, because why would they? But, and stories that I've done regularly get picked up by the nationals because we just are really nimble and pick the targets well. So the reason I'm saying that is because there is that alternative now. The barrier to entry is so low compared to when you'd need access to capital, that you need to be a rich man, whether that's a liberal rich man or a Tory rich man, you would not need that. The Yorkshire Post, which used to be owned by Yorkshire Conservative Newspapers Limited, is that right? You must know. Did you know that? Sorry, that's very unfair to spring. I think that's right. That was sold to a local newspaper group in the 2000s, along with the Scotsman. I think the combined sales price of 2 different purchases. I think combined sales price was about 400 million, and they were offloaded 15 years later for 5 million. That is the collapse in value and worth. They are essentially local print newspapers are essentially toxic assets that are being run at a steady decline. Not one sells more than 10,000 copies a day now. All of which is to say that there is sort of, the old world is collapsing, something new will rise up. What that looks like and whether that can be controlled by rich men. The counterintuitive point I would say is that maybe not, but if you chuck a lot of money at a lot of things, you can definitely buy influence. Just look at Saudi Arabia and how they're doing it. It will be less, I own one of 10 outlets, and much more, I own one of those 10 outlets, and I'm also chucking 100 million at these influencers, and I'm also doing this and this and this and this.
The fascinating part of that is that quandary of how you sort of disrupt a media landscape that feels like you need X amount of millions to buy into. That was a historical question as well. I mean, in Sheffield's case, there is this newspaper called the Sheffield Guardian. As the name suggests, it's left-wing. It's the paper of the local labour movement. And it does sort of broadly succeed in one way, that it survives a lot longer than many of these papers. It exists between 1906 and 1916. But they're very conscious of the difficulties and challenges about penetrating an established media market where these bigger entities, not just the Independent and the Telegraph, but the national dailies as well, hold sway. And they've got no money. They're sort of passionate activists who believe in the cause almost to the most hyper-dogmatic level you can imagine. We kind of probably can picture the type, I think. But they're really committed, they're really passionate. They do sort of make it succeed on one level. Broadly speaking, it's the First World War that kills it off, and the financial struggles that causes. So, but it's been a sort of eternal question, particularly when it comes to print media, is how you sort of break the paradigm in terms of money talking effectively. And that's the advantage that the Rowntrees have, although even this evening we've seen that they can't underwrite infinite losses all the time. At some point, the practical financial implications of trying to own and operate these things does start to loom really large, and how much chasing that political influence is actually ends up being worth in the long run.
But then I kind of want to challenge, I want to find something positive. So in my PhD research, strangely I've managed to time it perfectly. I've actually been looking at 18th century newspapers today, reading about the fact that all of the problems that we've discussed tonight have existed since the very beginning. The question of where's the money coming from, objectivity versus getting people interested, all of that has been there right from the start. So newspapers in some form or another they've survived this long. So what are the positives in the development of a new era, the chaotic way that we access news now? What can we say that's good about that?
I have a very low opinion of my own industry. I think there is genuinely, people do respond to, a certain sort of person responds well to stories that are told well and done well. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have been sent a link to a publication that they'd have never in a million years have read 20 years ago and gone, that's fascinating, or a podcast that they'd have never thought to look up that a friend has told them is great and they've just learned something that's blown their mind about the world. Or YouTube in particular, it can both radicalize people, but it can also, really, really inform them and give, you don't have to be up tape recording something on BBC Two at 2 in the morning. You can just watch it whenever you want. So there's a lot of positives around that. I would say the biggest flaw is that because free content is increasingly not profitable unless you have truly millions, that middle ground of the sort of the quite nice piece of the solid local paper that does a decent job, that's really under threat. You're either aiming for people who can cough up and pay out, or an elite well-off audience, or you're relying increasingly on nation states or Paul Marshall or something like that. God, I thought you said something positive. You wanted something positive.
You managed it for a little bit.
Managed it for a little bit.
But even that, I mean, one of the fascinating but also quite off-putting things about Edwardian newspapers, with the notable exception of the Daily Express, is their first few pages are just adverts. Can you imagine that today if you go to your newsstand because you want your daily copy of the Mail or whatever, and you're confronted by just classified ads on the front page? No one's going to pick that up, no one's going to buy it. But that's what they were like, because that is their primary source of revenue. Buying the paper is neither here nor there. That doesn't raise enough money. In fact, Lord Northcliffe, when he launched the Mail, that was his genius, that don't charge anything, hardly speaking, for this, because you can make your money back through the sort of through the advertisements, the classified, etc. And so, but that tension has always been there. They even newspapers like the Sheffield Independent, which has this sort of vibrant, it covers national issues, but it has this vibrant sense of the Sheffield scene and what's happening in terms of, local charitable endeavours, political meetings, business activity. But you have to wade through the adverts to get to this stuff. It's usually like page 4 or 5 before that kicks in a paper that's probably sort of like 12 to 16 pages most of the time. It goes down to as few as 4 or 6 pages during the First World War, for example. So they've always had that tension that because the market doesn't have the plurality back then, at least for a time, that it does now, they can get away with it, but very quickly that becomes eroded and they don't have as much room for manoeuvre.
Great, thank you. It was a great discussion. Can I open to the floor if we've got any questions in the audience? Yes.
Just listening to this makes me feel, I've not really thought about it before, how wrong the Rowntrees were in their strategy. They were, liberalism was collapsing, or, you know, liberalism virtually disappeared as a medical force by the end of the 1920s. And so they were trying to, they had their fingers in the dike, effectively. And, you know, and no wonder it went wrong. And I think if they actually really wanted to change things, they should have listened to what you said. I would have said they should have switched from liberalism to social democracy, bought a national paper that supported the emerging Labour Party, and they've been influential for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it seems to me that there's a sentimentality attached, because the Rowntrees, quote unquote, such important and good people for Europe. But in this instance, they seem to me have got, you know, they've just got the wrong strategy completely. And that, they lost the case. And that must have been because of their deep attachment to liberalism. You know, and Seaburn Rowntree and Lloyd George and what have you, you know, they couldn't break away from that, even though it was actually collapsing before their eyes.
So there's a really interesting, there's kind of two parts that I can say in response to that. You're right. I mentioned about H.W. Massingham, who started off as a Liberal. He falls out with the Rowntrees as he's becoming more of a Labour supporter. So there definitely is that kind of unwillingness to adapt to the realities of the developing political situation. But that being said, the Rowntrees' ownership of newspapers continued on past the Second World War. And one of the points that we were going to try and look at when I did the internship was actually the point at which they stepped back completely from newspaper ownership was the point at which they finally managed to start making money consistently. And I was going to try and examine, like, why? But my internship was very limited on hours, so we didn't get that far. But there is a lot more to the story. I covered the first sort of 20 years. There's another 20, 30 years to consider after that, and the story does adapt and change. Sorry, I can't tell you more.
I guess what I would say to your point, again, I don't disagree with it, but I would say slightly differently that they're right, but they're just right for a very short-lived period. Before the social dynamics of British society, the rise of class divisions becomes too predominant. For liberalism to thrive, and therefore for papers that try and represent liberalism in their coherence, says, because the party is far too much of a broad church as it existed in the Edwardian period. At one extreme, you have the clerks, who are more like Tories, and actually have a more natural fidelity to people who are conservatives often. And then people like Wilson, who are more at home with working men, with the radical politics of the late 19th century, the politics of the chapel rather than of the Anglican Church, for instance. So they're not wrong in a sense that the tactic won't accomplish some of the things that they want to do. I mean, even Lloyd George, he buys his own newspaper. He funds it by selling honours in a slightly illicit way. But he buys the News Chronicle and he uses it to push the brand of Lloyd George in the late teens, early 1920s. And so it's still, even then, it's seen as paramount to have a platform in the country without a newspaper in the era just before radio becomes so compelling a source of news and information and entertainment. You don't have anything. You know, the era of being able to stump the country in a way that a Gladstone would have done with the Midlothian campaign in the 1880s, that's gone. The newspaper is the way you do that. So I don't think they're necessarily naive in what they're hoping. It's just the landscape moves too quickly.
Yes, over here.
Follow up with that, and partly follow up the other question there. And address the slightly to Jim as well. I wonder too about the Rowntrees and with new media. Again, that's part of that sentimentality is true. When by the end of this period, you've got radio coming in, and you've got cinema and newsreel, and Seaburn himself is very suspicious of that media, and he thought of his entertainment. So as there are new forms of, if you like, delivering news, for him was not as good as the traditional written word, as it were. And when you read his English Life and Leisure of 1951, it's really a diatribe about the cinema and all its evils, but he doesn't see the value of the newsreels and things. So very interesting. He didn't. I mean, unlike Paul Marshall, he didn't spot, I think, that the technology was changing too, you know, and that therefore the ways in which you keep up to date is not simply about your principles, well, of course that's etc., but actually if you want to keep that going, it was just the beginnings of that this time. It wasn't as rapid as now, of course, but, you know, and they weren't engaging in the way they might have with those sort of modern technologies of news distribution. I don't know.
But I think, I mean, Jim can certainly speak to some of the more recent trends in that regard, but with newspapers, there is a sort of failure of recognition about what the product actually is by the Edwardian period. It's kind of this tension between the high-minded Victorian ideal of newspapers as an educational, informative product. You quite solemnly learn about the issues of the day, whether that's a sort of diplomatic exchange or the verbatim transcript of a debate in Parliament. It's important that you read that stuff and that you absorb it. But newspapers have moved beyond that quite rapidly with the rise of the popular press, which is sensationalist. It's exciting, it's scandal, it's crime, and this is the Northcliffe Revolution, the so-called new journalism. And that's bleeding into the provincial press as well. You know, because if you've got the Daily Mail that's telling you about, you know, that royal wedding somewhere, or Britain's expansion on the Afghan border, you know, that's more exciting than the local fate, or indeed a worthy transcript of the local meeting at the Free Trade Hall from the previous evening. And this is the problem that, you know, people like Seaborn potentially, that they don't recognise or accept that change has happened because they're wedded to that more earlier ideal. But that's sort of, if it's not dead, it's certainly dying by this point in time.
I mean, people have always been stinking hypocrites when it comes to their media consumption habits and what they say they want versus what they want. I want positive news about things that are nice in my area. No, you don't. You're going to keep clicking or reading on the sort of the crime story, the salacious thing. It is a tension as old as time when it comes to that. And the same with modern formats. You see this again and again in media history, that that there is a new format that comes along and someone new masters it in a way while everyone else keeps pretending that they're a bit above all that, and then 10 years later they panic and adopt everything that they'd rejected for the previous decade.
I think as well there's a sense, it links into what you said, Jim, at the start of your talk, that the written word today retains a strange level of influence because certain people think that it retains a level of influence, and I think that can be to some extent applied to that situation, that because families like the Rowntrees and the Cadburys and then bigger families, etc., or wealthier pockets were still pushing this, then it was kept alive perhaps a little longer than it would have been otherwise.
At the back.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just thinking, particularly for Jim, but also for the rest of you, but I'm interested in, I should declare an interest, I'm the head of media for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We've been very much feeling real pain around the apocalyptic kind of media landscape and the big kind of everything. But also, what I'd really like to get your thoughts about, and I think it's really interesting that you talk about funding potentially kind of influencers rather than buying a newspaper, and that kind of model. But I'm also interested in the fact that we also know that the media landscape is fueling kind of extreme views, and how you try and sort of pull people away from those. And I'm thinking specifically about the fact that 91% of news deserts in the US voted for Trump, and like, is something like that happening here? And if you were specifically trying to pull people away from the extreme views that the kind of rage bait of the kind of online news world is doing, is there something that you could do to try and get a media landscape that supports sort of pulling people back from that range?
Everything is filtered by about 4 or 5 algorithms that will set the entire way that this room is thinking, even if they don't realise it, because that's setting how the BBC producer is consuming the world. That's setting how the politician, who no longer has the local newspaper political editor to bounce ideas off, but is instead staring at Twitter going, is this what the public really think on small boats, or is this just what I'm seeing in my feed? Everything is shaped by those above everything else, and that's where nation states basically have to decide whether they're willing to intervene or not. One justification could be almost on public health grounds, that the nation is becoming sick because of the stuff that it's believing. It's a very hard case to make. I did a lot of early reporting on Facebook radicalisation before it was I first noticed it while covering 2014 in Scotland in the referendum, and I did pieces with headlines like, "Some people in Scotland don't believe the BBC," and that was like literally news. It was like, what a fascinating idea. Or like, and that was the very first time I was just on the street encountering made up fake stuff that had circulated online that was widely accepted as fact. Obviously that's nothing new, there's always been oral traditions and things have spread. But in terms of, I think two things. One, the British public is not as radicalised and extreme as you would think, that but the media they're seeing increasingly is, because that is what will stop you scrolling for that fraction of a second. If you actually analyse yourself, look at yourself as the patient, look how long you take it before you scroll on to the next thing, it is a fraction of a second. It is beyond that. If you haven't grabbed someone in that's all the time that you've got to consume. And that the idea of forcing people, and it comes back to the previous question, the eat your greens problem is getting, you just can't make people consume the news anymore. You used to get to the end of the 9 p.m. drama and there'd just be the news on and you'd probably catch the opening bit and you'd sort of vaguely know what was going on in the world, and that was that. You just can't force people because they're just going to flick the second it's boring them and they're not interested. So yeah, I think there's two predictions. And why not just chuck something out? One, that you might see some sort of shift to must carry public service style announcements, because at the moment we're in a near unprecedented, probably for the first time since the English Civil War, where a government cannot get its message across to the masses. It has no, if you are Keir Starmer, actually getting your message to people is very, very, very hard now. You just can't do it. And even 5 years ago, you could reach that mass with broadcast and things like that. And that secondly, everything will come down to whether or not there is any real ability or willingness to rein in the big algorithms that just shape everything, including, I obviously like to think I float above it all not being influenced. I'm also not inoculated to it. We all are, to a certain extent. You know, there's one Chinese algorithm somewhere that is shaping a lot of what we're all consuming.
And on that note, I think we're going to bring it to a close. No, don't worry. Well, we've got a few words. We'll finish off. So first of all, I'd like to thank the audience for coming tonight and for those fantastic questions we've just had. I'd also like to thank our speakers, and Olivia, who's been working with the Rowntree Society, has got a few things for you. While Olivia's getting them, I'd also like to thank Bootham School for hosting us tonight. And yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Olivia. Oh, amazing. Well, thank you very much.
And just before we do finish, if you'd like to read more about Charlotte's research for the Rowntree Society, her blog's on her website and you can currently find it on our homepage. And if you'd like to stay up to date with the work of the Rowntree Society, the best way is to sign up to our newsletter. You can also do this via our website, and there's also ways to donate to us. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and YouTube. So hopefully we can try and, beat or manipulate these algorithms. All our online presence can be found via the QR code for anyone who uses those. And to bring us to a close, I'd like to hand over to Liz Grierson, the Rowntree Society's chair.
A very quick thank you. This event marks the end of this centenary year, and I think it's been what more in the old days would have been called a hill humdinger of an event, and this has done everything that we could have wished that it could do for something like this. We, the Rowntree Society, prides itself in bringing relevance to the ideas and ideals of the Rowntrees and seeing how they can be seen in contemporary ways there. The Rowntree Society was formed astonishingly 21 years ago And I think if you had asked them then, would they still be around in 2025? Well, there might be somebody here in the audience who could answer that, but I think they would have thought they wouldn't be. They were formed at a time when the legacy and the history of the Rowntree was in the point that it was failing and becoming unknown within the community of York and the hinterland. And essentially then the question comes as to why does it exist? And if you'll excuse a rather sort of facile and almost sort of silly analogy, the Rowntrees' legacy and history and family are a bit like an enormous box of chocolates. There are the soft ones, the soft stories, the soft whatever. There are the hard ones. There are the ones that are easily recognisable. They're the ones that get gobbled up very quickly. There are the ones that are wrapped in very fiddly little packages that you have to try and get them apart to try and understand them a bit more. And then, as always with the box of chocolates, there's those ones that are left behind when people are looking and thinking, well, we don't know what that is, and if we prod it a little bit, we might see. But we all know that we have to get through eating those before we're allowed to get to the next layer of the chocolate box. And when the next layer has been lifted, there again are a whole range of new shapes, new flavours, new areas to cover. And I think tonight, you could say, why in this year are we getting to this story? And it's because there are so many layers and stories that have been told, in a sense, on the way to this story. And it's great that we've been able to keep going till we get to stories like this that are extraordinary and amazing. And so many people who I told I was coming to this event, what, Rowntrees have a newspaper? So many, and it has brought up so many issues that are timely and of their time too, and so many interesting questions as to what were they trying to do, what are people trying to do now. Arnold, or Chocolate Jumbo, would I think have been in his days astonished to have discovered that in the way things are going, that as an advertising man, this last year was the first year in which all consumer goods advertising, so if you take the whole bulk of it, more than 50% of the budget was spent on influencers rather than in the media. And that is the sort of the significance of the change that we're living through. But we will remain here, picking up and looking at delicious chocolates and delicious things that will keep we hope keep you entertained and keep you interested in the Rowntree story. And thank this wonderful panel for giving us just a real example of what that story can be and can mean to us today. So it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, and class dismissed, I guess.